Okay, hitting play.
Look closer at who tried to overturn the presidential election, and you'll see a lot of the militants behind the riots are anti-choice extremists. Derek Evans stalked clinic workers, arrested for storming the Capitol. Taylor Hansen, clinic protester, insurrectionist. Elijah Schaffer, anti-choice activist, broke into Nancy Pelosi's office. Abby Johnson, anti-choice celebrity, promoted events tied to the failed coup. And Senators Cruz and Hawley. So when these extremists march for life, remember who they are.
Muchos de esos militantes del 6 de enero son extremistas contra el derecho a decidir. Derek Evans acosaba a trabajadores de las clínicas, arrestado por asaltar el Capitolio. Taylor Hansen, manifestante en las clínicas, insurrecto. Elijah Schaffer, en contra del derecho a elegir, entró a la fuerza a la oficina de Nancy Pelosi. Abby Johnson, activista contra el derecho de elegir, promovió eventos atados al golpe fallido. Y los senadores Cruz y Hawley. Entonces, cuando estos extremistas marchen por la vida, recuerda quiénes son.
Look closer at who tried to overturn the presidential election, and you'll see a lot of the militants behind the riots are anti-choice extremists. Derek Evans stalked clinic workers, arrested for storming the Capitol. Taylor Hansen, clinic protester, insurrectionist. Elijah Schaffer, anti-choice activist, broke into Nancy Pelosi's office. Abby Johnson, anti-choice celebrity, promoted events tied to the failed coup. And Senators Cruz and Hawley. So when these extremists march for life, remember who they are. Look.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Doubling Down for WHPA. We are so happy to have you here tonight and appreciate you taking the time to join us. My name is Amy Williams-Navarro. I am the Manager of Legislative Affairs at Nero Pro-Choice America, and I will be your MC for the evening. We have a really wonderful program set up for you. We have great panelists and amazing speakers. But before we get started, I have a couple of housekeeping items to go through. So as many of you know, NARAL is fighting in states and at the federal level to block attacks on abortion access, elect champions for reproductive freedom, and push elected officials in Washington, D.C. and state capitals to fight for reproductive freedom for everybody. And we are going to start off by getting to know each other. So in the chat, please share your name, your pronouns, where you're located, and why you joined today's event about the Women's Health Protection Act. And a quick note about pronouns. At NARAL, we are committed to advocating for reproductive freedom for everybody and respecting and honoring every person's gender identity. So for anyone new to introducing yourself with gender pronouns, we use pronouns to identify ourselves and to make sure that we're not making assumptions about people's gender identities. So examples of pronouns include she, her, hers, they, them, theirs, he, him, his. So go ahead and add your introduction in the chat, or if you're joining us from Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter on our social media in the comments. We would love to know who's with us today. So with that, we'll go to the next slide for our community agreements. So community agreements are a set of norms. They're aspirational. They're a vision of how we want to be in relationship with one another in this space. So I'll go ahead and read these quickly on the slide. We commit to engaging each other with respect and in good faith. We acknowledge that there is no reproductive freedom without freedom from tyranny and oppression. Freedom is for everybody, including women and transgender and non-binary people. And you are part of the 8 in 10 Americans who support the legal right to abortion. And so if you are watching on social media, if you're watching live on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, please make sure to use the hashtag #PassWHPA and hashtag disinfodebunk in your posts. And don't forget to share tonight's Facebook Live and follow Nero on Twitter. So at this absolutely critical moment in the fight for reproductive freedom, we are really glad to have you all join us today with our amazing speakers to discuss how the anti-choice movement is attempting to spread disinformation and distort the narrative around Texas's ban on abortion and potential copycat bans, all with the goal of ending the legal right to abortion. And we'll also talk about how the anti-choice movement is co-opting science and spreading disinformation, which has created implications for providers. And we'll go into the importance of the Women's Health Protection Act, which we call WHPA for short, which is a federal bill that would protect the legal right to abortion throughout the United States. And the good news is that WHPA has already passed the US House of Representatives, and it has the support of the White House. So its final hurdle is now the Senate. You'll get more about that from our panelists. At the end of this event, we are going to be making calls to encourage senators to vote yes on WHPA. So please stay on till the end of the webinar to take this super important action. As a former Hill staffer, I can tell you those calls matter. Members of Congress really like to hear from their constituents and will take into account what they're hearing from their districts. So really making these calls for WHPA are the most important thing that we can do nationally to protect the right to abortion. So we have an incredible panel to unpack these issues with us. I will introduce NARAL's Chief Campaigns and Advocacy Officer, Christian Lebu, who is joining us to introduce our keynote speaker for the evening, Senator Reverend Warnock. Christian, I'll kick it off to you.
Hello, NARAL Pro-Choice America members and everyone watching on Facebook Live. I'm Christian Lebu, Chief Campaigns and Advocacy Officer with NARAL Pro-Choice America. That's at CW Lebu for those of you following along on Twitter, and I am thrilled to have you all joining us tonight. We have an amazing lineup of speakers and champions joining us for an incredibly important discussion at a critical moment for reproductive freedom and access to abortion care. First, I'm honored to introduce our keynote speaker, the United States Senator from Georgia, Reverend Raphael Warnock, who will discuss the implications of the vigilante enforced bans on abortion, like SB 8, copycat legislation, and the importance of the Senate passing the Women's Health Protection Act to safeguard the legal right to abortion. Senator Reverend Warnock is a Baptist minister and a reproductive freedom champion who has consistently stood up for our fundamental rights and taken bold action to protect and expand abortion access for everybody, including co-sponsoring the Women's Health Protection Act, or WHPA. NARAL Pro-Choice Georgia has spent the last 3 years laying the foundation to build progressive momentum and the infrastructure necessary to make Georgia a key battleground state, help flip Georgia blue, and mobilize more than 54,000 members across the state to turn out for lawmakers who support freedom and gender justice, like Senator Reverend Warnock. Without further ado, it is my deep honor to turn it over to Senator Reverend Raphael Warnock.
Greetings to NARAL Pro-Choice America. Thank you, Christian LeBou, for the welcome, and all the members and activists who are listening today for the hard work you've done to protect the right to choose, including the work being done right now in our NARAL chapter right here in Georgia. Let's be very clear. I am, and I always will be, a pro-choice pastor. And I believe that we must do everything in our power to protect reproductive health care. This is a dangerous time for women in our nation whose health care and human rights are being undermined and challenged all across the country. And so we must do all that we can to protect a woman's right to choose what is best for her body. And that includes passing the Women's Health Protection Act. Know that you will always have a partner in me in the United States Senate and our communities to advance the voices of women and their rights to protect their ability to choose. Thank you for all the work that you do. Keep the faith and keep looking up.
Thank you for that, Senator Reverend Warnock. With that, it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's panelists. So we have Dr. Deshaun Taylor Md. She is a gynecologist and family planning specialist, gender-affirming care provider, and reproductive justice advocate who established Desert Star Family Planning Clinic in Phoenix in 2013 and founded Desert Star Institute for Family Planning, a nonprofit organization of which she is president in 2017. Recognized in 2020 by the Maricopa County NAACP as a trailblazer, Dr. Taylor is committed to preserving and advancing access to reproductive health care for people who can become pregnant through service provision, education, and training, and sharing her expertise with various national, state, and local boards, committees, and programs. We are really grateful to have her with us tonight. Gabriela Rico is the research coordinator at NARAL Pro-Choice America, where she monitors the anti-choice movement and conducts strategic research to combat its extreme rhetoric and disinformation about reproductive freedom. She specializes in Spanish language disinformation, medication abortion, and tech accountability work. And prior to joining NARAL, Gabby worked in research and communications for progressive causes and studied human rights law at the Paris School of International Affairs. Kate Ryan is my boss and also the government relations director at NARAL Pro-Choice America, overseeing the development and implementation of legislative and policy strategies at the federal and state level to advance reproductive freedom and defend against anti-choice attacks. Previously, she led the Women's Health Safety Program at the National Women's Health Network, worked on healthcare reform and women's issues for U.S. Representative Joe Sestak, and worked to advance international women's rights in the Middle East and North and West Africa. Kate received her Master's of Public Administration from the NYU Wagner Graduate School of Public Service. So with that, I will kick it over to Kate.
All right. Hi, everybody. Well, thank you so much, Amy. That was excellent. And I am really just can't tell you how much exciting it is to have all of you here to talk about this tonight. It is, unfortunately, we're at the moment. We're at the moment. This is very, very real. And it's sort of a make it or break it time for access to abortion and reproductive freedom more broadly. I'm going to jump right in and I'll warn everybody in advance. It's a real negative presentation. Anti-reproductive freedom politicians in states across the country, and Dr. Taylor is going to talk about this more specifically, are waging a war. This year alone, anti-choice lawmakers have introduced, advanced, or passed over 300 bills attacking reproductive freedom and abortion access, with Texas's SB 8, the vigilante abortion ban, being the most extreme of many. On December 1st, the Supreme Court is going to hear oral arguments in a case that directly challenges Roe v. Wade and the legal right to abortion. I want to talk a little bit about the case in terms of Texas and the other case that we're hearing, we know we have oral arguments on in just a couple of weeks, December 1st. So Mississippi passed a 15-week abortion ban in 2018. It was immediately challenged by litigators at the Center for Reproductive Rights and was found clearly unconstitutional by a district court that same year. The state of Mississippi appealed to the Fifth Circuit, notably one of the most conservative judicial circuits in the country. So sort of the bundles of states kind of fall into various circuits. That's who they appeal to between your district court and the Supreme Court. And even the Fifth Circuit upheld the district court's ruling that this abortion ban was unconstitutional. It was clearly in violation of Roe v. Wade. Despite this, Mississippi appealed to the Supreme Court. It is worth noting that the Supreme Court we are dealing with is a Trump supermajority. 6 of the justices are clearly anti-choice. And so we are in a moment where a case that directly challenges Roe's core holding will be heard by this Supreme Court. It is really worth saying this, and you're probably going to hear me say it a couple of times because, power and repetition, as Gabby will tell us once we get to disinfo, that there is no way for this court to uphold Mississippi's ban without striking down Roe v. Wade. Gabby will get into more about how the anti-choice folks will try to convince you otherwise. I wouldn't be surprised, frankly, if the Supreme Court tied themselves up into knots, trying not to use the words overturn Roe. But that is what's on the table, whether they say it or not. And that's the bottom line. Because we will have to combat that disinformation, and that's worth naming. So the other piece of this that's worth saying explicitly is that while Roe is often used as a synonym for the legality of abortion, it is possible that the Supreme Court could uphold Mississippi's 15-week ban. It doesn't mean all abortion care everywhere at every moment is illegal, but that's still Roe being struck down. Just because abortion care may be available earlier than 15 weeks, and that is if the Supreme Court doesn't wrap in Texas's 6-week ban, we are still looking at a dire crisis in access to abortion, one that Dr. Taylor's on the front lines of. And so it's really worth naming that we don't know what we'll see in June. NARAL, in alignment with our partners, will be communicating with folks as we watch oral arguments in December. We would expect a decision on this Mississippi abortion ban case next summer in June, typically. But in terms of the state of the court and the state of minds of the justices, the court's refusal to block Texas's obviously unconstitutional ban tells us that they're okay with allowing Texas to render Roe meaningless in their state, and it indicates a willingness to overturn Roe next year. Despite the anti-choice movement's relentless efforts to restrict and ban abortion access, 8 in 10 people, as Amy said, support the legal right to abortion. There is not, despite sort of the controversial 50-50, one side, the other side, that is not true of abortion. And that is why we need to pass the Women's Health Protection Act. This is a bill that would safeguard the federal right to abortion, even if Roe falls, so that it won't then fall back to the states, where some states might be able to preserve access, others won't. And even in the states that could preserve access, realistically, there will be a surge of patients from states where abortion is no longer legal. So it's not as straightforward as saying, I live in, I'll use California as an example because our California director says this all the time. I live in California, it's fine. It won't be there either. There will be concussive effects. And so the Women's Health Protection Act would ensure that these types of abortion bans and restrictions are unlawful. And we're being clear that it is particularly harmful to Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, immigrants, young people, people with disabilities, LGBTQ plus individuals, those living in rural and medically underserved areas, the folks that will be impacted by abortion bans broadly. And WHPA is the critical step. As Amy said, what we need to do is pass it in the Senate. And President Biden will sign it, but we need to pass it in the Senate. I'm going to stop there. And thank you, Amy. And I think I'm turning it over to Dr. Taylor.
All right, well, good evening.
Travis, could you move on to the next slide?
I'm Dr. Deshaun Taylor. Amy gave a wonderful introduction, so I won't take much more time with that. I am so glad to be a part of this event with you all tonight. I want to shout out everyone here in the chat. Thank you for introducing yourselves so we can know who's in the building. And also want to recognize the folks who are streaming live with us. Welcome. I want to approach the introduction to our panel discussion today in a way that I generally like to approach reproductive health care as a provider and as an advocate. It can be very oppressive to seek reproductive health care in our country. And there are so many different ways that people are impacted. And we start to see the most extremes in obstacles and difficulties when people are attempting to access abortion care more specifically. But it's difficult to access reproductive health care. And regardless of gender, socioeconomic status, zip code, there are barriers erected all around us for various reasons. And so as we approach the discussion, and as you all who have joined us tonight kind of leave this and approach this discussion, I want you to think about the three major frameworks to address reproductive oppression. And so we have the reproductive health framework, which addresses service delivery. And so one of the things that I do with my nonprofit is I work to train future abortion providers. And so I'm not just specifically providing them like technical skills and how to actually perform the abortion, but also those soft skills in terms of how to have conversations with people who may be from different walks of life than yourself, who may have different access to resources than yourself. You want to be looking at the entire person, right? And not just the specific issue that's brought them in for the service. Because when we take a more holistic approach to this, then we start to see some of the barriers that people start to face accessing care, right? So we have the service delivery where in Arizona, about 87% of our state lives in a place in Arizona where they don't have an abortion provider. So since 2009, there has been a new abortion restriction passed in this state every year, except for one. And this has concentrated abortion care essentially into the Phoenix metro area for this very expansive state where, people have to travel into the Phoenix metro area to receive abortion care. And so where there are providers, people need to get to us, right? And then we have the reproductive rights framework where we're addressing legal issues around people's ability to have the right to seek abortion care as part of essential health care, right? And so we have these conversations about Roe v. Wade, and as Kate mentioned, how we think of Roe as synonymous as, with the legality of abortion. And so, there are some real clear concerning attacks to the Roe v. Wade landmark decision happening. We are definitely in a moment. And so I've really started to shift the way that I'm talking about abortion access into the reproductive justice framework. And so that's focusing on movement building, because it's not helpful to a person to have a right to an abortion when they aren't able to access that right? So, if a person in Arizona has the right to have an abortion in Arizona, but has to travel 3 hours to get one, and doesn't have a car, can't find a ride, doesn't have all of the money, or maybe does have some money, but needs to pay rent and buy food, then what does it matter to them that they have the legal right to the abortion? And so it's really important that we really start thinking about how we can start to look at the intersections of people's ability to be able to get, first of all, have access to the care that they need by having a provider in the vicinity of where they live. Then we're looking at these laws and all of these targeted restrictions aimed at abortion providers that make it difficult to provide the care, as well as actual restrictions on who, when, and how, right, people can access abortion care. And then we start to look at what resources do people need to actually be able to exercise their right to receive the care. And so this is where when we're looking at this from a justice lens, from a reproductive justice lens, then we really start to figure out, different ways that we can start to impact people's access to abortion. And I think that because we're so focused on the right, some of these nuances get missed. They get kind of pushed out to the side, out into the periphery. And then, and I think when we're having these legal challenges, right? And then these judges are saying, well, is this really an undue burden? Like that whole undue burden situation, right? Well, if there's only one provider left in Louisiana, had that been a different decision that we were following, previously at the Supreme Court, right? Then, well, is that really an undue burden? And so you have people like debating these types of questions, and it's like, well, of course it's an undue burden to have only one abortion provider for an entire state. But again, when we don't look at the holistic picture of how people access care and the things that people need to be able to have autonomy over their bodies, and then have the actual resources to be able to obtain the accurate information that they need so that they can make the decision that's best for them, and then actually go achieve the outcome that they're looking for. Then, we set ourselves up for these situations where people can start to debate, whether, how much burden is a burden. So I just wanted to, introduce this into our discussion and into the thought processes for people who are participating, because oftentimes I hear reproductive rights and reproductive justice being used interchangeably, and they're not. It's been really great for me kind of evolving in my work. I've been providing abortion care for 20 years. And, I've had my own evolution in this work in terms of, you know, for many people, just providing abortion care, participating in people actually receiving the care is a political act. But honestly, it shouldn't be, right? Abortion is healthcare. So why should it be a political issue to just come to work, provide healthcare to people, and just do your job as a physician, a clinician, a medical assistant, a nurse, like any other person who goes to work to do their job in healthcare? And so, but unfortunately, in you know, the climate that we have in this country, just going to work and doing your job is a political act. And so it's been something that I've kind of worked through and grown through, like being kind of thrusted into this advocacy role, because I care very deeply, right, about people accessing abortion care and being able to maintain, potentially grow access to people so that they can exercise their autonomy to chart their course for their reproductive lives. And so I think that that's all the introduction that I want to provide, because we are going to get into a pretty meaty conversation here. And so we're going to pass it on to Gabriella, I believe.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Taylor, and thank you so much for putting up that framework and helping people understand the differences between those movements. I think it's super important, and it's something that I wasn't aware of until I started working at Nero and really got into, you know, the trenches of a lot of this stuff. And I also want to thank you for the care that you provide, and I'm super excited to be here with you and the other panelists. So I'm just going to talk really briefly, and then we can jump into some Q&A. But first, I want to tell you all about what we do at the research team at NARAL. So a large part of what we do is closely monitoring the anti-choice movement to understand what narratives and disinformation that they're promoting about abortion and reproductive freedom. For decades, spreading disinformation has been a core strategy of the anti-choice movement because their policies are unpopular and they're harmful to people and they are not supported by science or medical expertise. So understanding what lies and misleading narratives that anti-choice activists are promoting is really key so that we can reach people and reach different audiences with the truth. So at NARAL, our opposition research informs our strategic research so that we can figure out the best way to inoculate people against disinformation and promote accurate information about abortion. So I'm going to discuss some of this disinformation and misleading anti-choice narratives later on. But before I do that, I really want to briefly talk about the way that some anti-choice activists are approaching this moment. Like Kate mentioned, we have some antis who are trying to downplay how extreme their policies are, and a lot of them are trying to hide the ball about their ultimate goal and the world that they are working to create. They know that we all here and beyond this call are fired up, and they know that people do not want the Supreme Court to overturn Roe versus Wade. So they're really doing everything that they can to muddy the waters and confuse people about what's at stake right now. You may see anti-choice groups claiming that they just want, quote, common sense restrictions on abortions. And that's really what Dobbs v. Jackson is about. It's not about overturning Roe. And that is false, as Kate mentioned. Whatever happens with this ban, if the court upholds it, it is essentially overturning Roe. So we need to make sure that everyone around us knows that it's not the case, that they are not trying to attack Roe. And SB8 is a really clear example of just how extreme these people are and the lengths that they are willing to go to block access to abortion care. So it's really important that all of us now are talking to people around us and helping them understand why this moment is so pivotal for the future of abortion access. So really excited to talk more about some of the disinformation that we're seeing and just hear from our fellow panelists so we can think more about what we can do about SB8 and copycat bans, as well as the upcoming SCOTUS case and WHPA.
Thank you all. That's a great way to kick off our discussion. Gabby, now that I have you, could you answer a basic level setting question and tell us the difference? We hear disinformation and misinformation used interchangeably. Can you talk about the difference and how the anti-choice movement uses it to erode reproductive freedom?
Absolutely. I love this question because, again, this is another distinction that I really wouldn't be as aware of if I wasn't entrenched in this work and this research. So misinformation is false or misleading information that is shared unintentionally. So all of us have probably done this at one point or another, of like clicking share on an article before fully reading it or verifying what it says. And that's completely unintentional. That's really different from disinformation, which is false information that is deliberately shared with the intent to mislead or manipulate people. So it's not an opinion that we disagree with. It's not something that people are sharing unknowingly or unintentionally. They know what they're sharing is false, and they're sharing it because they have a motivation to do so. So what we see with the anti-choice movement is the deliberate propagation of disinformation. The movement is actively promoting false and misleading claims in order to get people to oppose abortion access and reproductive freedom. And like I mentioned earlier, this has been a core strategy from the very beginning of the anti-choice movement. It has always been an unpopular movement, and reproductive freedom has been widely supported by most people. So what the anti-choice movement has done is they've really built up this entire infrastructure to create and amplify disinformation from the top of the movement down. That's why you might be aware there's a ton of like anti-choice news sites that exist out there that just publish propaganda and like these really kooky stories. And there's also what they call like research organizations like the Charlotte Lozier Institute or the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And those are not unbiased groups. Those are groups specifically created to legitimize disinformation and to help spread it. And so the anti-choice movement really just uses disinformation to try to manipulate the conversation about reproductive freedom and kind of try to win people to their side.
Thanks, Gabby. That's really informative. And it prompts me to ask Dr. Taylor, could you talk about disinformation that we frequently hear, or I guess it could be misinformation in some cases, but that we hear around the safety of abortion care, and how does it impact your patients and your practice?
So specifically as it relates to one of the restrictions or that we have, well, I guess not a restriction, but like an excessive, unnecessary law that is placed on abortion providers is to, provide scripted information to people to tell them, certain things like abortion can cause breast cancer, or that your medical abortion can be reversed. And, so these types of things that people may have heard about that are not factual. And that is, disinformation, right? So it is, they are purposefully providing information that is false to people to try to impact their decision to have an abortion. And they're using then legal, the legislature to then force healthcare professionals that people trust, right, in general, to be able to, use us in a manner to provide this information and legitimize it. And so it is, as a provider who is in a position to have to provide scripted information to people, then, I basically, tell them that I'm required by law to provide you this information. This is not something that we generally discuss with people who are seeking abortion care. It's required by law for you to receive this. And then I move on to the information that I normally would discuss with you. And so here this is. So that's kind of how I personally go through it. But it doesn't help because people are already a bit confused with our poor sex education. People don't really know very much about their bodies. And so then, when you're coming into a situation where you don't really know much about your body, and then you're seeking care that you are a bit intimidated about, if not scared, and then, you have people who you think you should trust being forced to provide you information, and that's not correct. That is just really erodes our relationships with our patients and the public. And it's just, it can become difficult to navigate sometimes.
Yeah, and I'm going to write off that with the next question in terms of, Texas SB 8 has gotten a lot of attention lately, but you just alluded to some restrictions that you face or unnecessary requirements that you have to put in place in Arizona. And Arizona recently saw SB 1457 take effect, and that's just one of many abortion restrictions in your home state. Could you tell us about the barriers pregnant people and you must navigate in order to receive and provide care respectively?
Yeah, so, SB 1457 is the most recent restriction that made its way and was signed by law by our governor here in Arizona. And it's a bit of a hodgepodge of a few different things that have been thrown in there. The thing that was, I think, most reported about was the ban on providing abortions for genetic diagnoses. And that actually was challenged. And it is enjoined at the moment. It is not being enforced, that portion of the law, but there are some other aspects of the law that were allowed to go into effect, as the judge felt that there wasn't enough evidence provided to show that allowing that portion of the law to go into effect was a problem. And so it's something that, as a provider, the uncertainty around how I don't want to say unclearly written laws, how they would be enforced, how we are supposed to comply. It's burdensome and it's confusing, and that's the point, right? And so that's the most recent. And so, as I mentioned, back in 2009, the first restriction started to flood through, and every year except one, there was something. And so basically what a pregnant person faces in accessing abortion care in Arizona now is that there is an initial consultation that must happen in person. And the person must receive an ultrasound to date the pregnancy. The person must receive the state mandated scripted information. And the person must also then wait 24 hours before they can proceed with their abortion care. And so at minimum, they have a required 2 days process to obtain an abortion in our state. We also have, for minors, notarized parental consent. And so these people have to go before a notary to sign a specific consent form that has been written up by the state, and then bring that in for the minor to be able to have an abortion. Telemedicine for medical abortion is banned. And so during this time of the COVID pandemic, where the Food and Drug Administration has lifted some of the restrictions around having to dispense or administer mifepristone, one of the medications used for medical abortion, in person, the people of Arizona aren't able to benefit from that because we have the ban on using telemedicine for abortion care. And so we haven't been able to provide additional protections that some other states have been able to provide for their pregnant people seeking abortion because of that ban. There's an admitting privileges law. So that is what really has kind of really pushed all of the care into the Phoenix metro area, where most of the providers, do have privileges at hospitals nearby. But it's a 12-mile radius that's required from the location that the abortion is being provided. It's also a physician-only state as well. So not even advanced practice clinicians can administer mifepristone either. So that really has created that situation that we have here in our state.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. It is hard to hear, but important. Kate, could you tell us about how the Women's Health Protection Act would help address some of these restrictions and barriers that Dr. Taylor just described?
Sure. And I want to say, as part of that, that really what you were saying, Dr. Taylor, about kind of how we conceive of Roe and the legal right, and how that is so completely disconnected from access to abortion on the ground. Roe is a floor, not a ceiling. And it is, I thank you for raising it, because I think, to your point, if abortion access continued exactly as it is now, it is unacceptably terrible access to a legal right, a constitutional right we supposedly have. Even if we don't overturn Roe, the status quo is in fact unacceptable, because it is so hard to practice and to receive care. And so part of what the Women's Health Protection Act is intended to do is, yes, shore up the legal right should Roe fall. But the Women's Health Protection Act was also crafted to address what you had raised around undue burden, which is essentially that sort of to take a little bit of a step back to say, so Roe established sort of recognized the constitutional right to abortion. However, Roe has been chipped away at in terms of state restrictions because another Supreme Court case called Planned Parenthood v. Casey allowed all of these restrictions to stand. So the idea that whether or not something is an undue burden, and if you essentially find that nothing is an undue burden, the only thing they found in that case to be an undue burden was spousal consent, if you can believe it. So when that's the only thing that is considered to be a problem, that is how we are at the point we're at today. So the Women's Health Protection Act would establish a right for physicians for medical providers to provide, and for patients to receive abortion care. It would also essentially clarify that, frankly, many of the restrictions that are in place in Arizona, but across the country, the kind of targeted regulations of abortion providers, so the admitting privileges cases, the biased counseling, the mandatory waiting periods, the mandatory ultrasounds. If WHPA were enacted, they would also be found to be a violation of federal law if the Women's Health Protection Act was enacted, because it is intended to go to Roe as abortion access as it was envisioned, not where it is today. But it's still worth saying it's not sufficient. We still need to deal with insurance coverage issues, access for young people. Women's Health Protection Act is not a panacea either. There will still be significantly more to be done to improve access once we achieve the Women's Health Protection Act. And there's other legislation, the EACH Act, for example, that would address insurance coverage. There are significant restrictions, putting it financially out of reach for millions.
Thanks, Kate. Going back to the disinformation piece of this evening, Gabby, you mentioned this briefly earlier, but could you discuss some of the false and misleading narratives that the anti-choice movement is deploying, but specifically to distort the narrative around SB8 and potential copycat bans?
Yes, and I will try to keep it brief. So I want to talk about two of the main ones that we're seeing, but just rest assured, there is a lot that they are doing to try to cover their tracks on this. And it's also worth keeping in mind that these are tactics and strategies and narratives that they're also trying to do around this upcoming Supreme Court case, Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health. So the first strategy is around co-opting feminism and claiming that abortion restrictions or bans are pro-woman. And that is something I have seen many antis say about Texas after the passage of SB8, which is so kooky if you think about it, because what SB8 actually does is restrict women and pregnant people's ability to access abortion care and also promote vigilantism and surveillance of pregnant people and women. So the background for this is that, part of what they do is antis will try to claim this high ground or this moral high ground by saying abortion is dangerous for women or it's harmful for women and pregnant people. That is completely false. There is no evidence for this, but what it does is it helps kind of promote this vision of antis as being people who care about women and pregnant people, and that's not the case at all. So they're also kind of using fake health centers to claim that, oh, well, women don't need to access abortion care because we have these fake health centers and alternatives to abortion programs. Worth mentioning, fake health centers are manipulative, they are coercive, they share false information, they share disinformation, and they are not a substitute for an actual reproductive healthcare provider, period. And the second thing is, regardless of whether you go to an alternatives to abortion program or a fake health center or whatever, if you are a person who is pregnant, who does not want to remain pregnant, none of those alternatives are going to help you. None of those alternatives are going to fully address the financial, the familial, the medical reasons why you might want to seek abortion care. So, and the last thing I'll say about the pro-woman narrative is that this is something they're pushing to try to claim, well, these laws can't be harming women or targeting women's rights because they're being passed by women, and women legislators are in charge of making these bills. Again, that's completely false, and it has nothing to do with actually how these laws impact people and how they harm people. It doesn't matter if there's a woman legislator who's writing it or who is introducing it. It matters the actual impact on women and pregnant people. And the second narrative that I'll talk about is just this narrative around science and claiming that science supports the anti-choice agenda. I'm going to start off by kind of saying the obvious, which is I have been watching the anti-choice movement the entirety of this pandemic, and they have been working at every turn to undermine confidence in public health measures like masks and social distancing. They have been spreading so much disinformation and fear-mongering about vaccines. These people are not pro-science in any way, shape, or form. So that should already tell you anything that they're saying about science is not something you should believe. But what they're trying to do is co-opt this public conversation that we're having right now about following the science and trying to protect people's health. And so it's really important to just remember and to remind people that medical experts have repeatedly established that these restrictions that they're pushing, bans like SB8, are not based in science. The terminology around so-called fetal heartbeats are, again, not based in science. We should never, ever repeat that term or use that term because it's not medically accurate. It is just rhetoric. And so that's just something to keep in mind as we go forward. That's something that they're claiming, that SB8 is grounded in science, that these restrictions that Mississippi is pushing are grounded in science. That is absolutely not the case. They are really just trying to misrepresent the situation to move forward these extreme bans on abortion and restrictions on abortion. So I'll leave it at that, but I could say so much more clearly.
Yes, thanks, Gabby. I mean, it is just important to note that this is all intentional, and all of these different streams of state attacks and the legal challenges and the disinformation are all working towards ultimately eroding the right to abortion. So we are going to move on to the audience portion of the Q&A right now. And we have already received many, many questions in the chat, so I will be reading some of them, but you should feel free to keep dropping them in. People are very interested in what our panelists have to say, which I love to see. So the first question is actually, and I think it's important to address, is when I want to refer to reproductive issues in generally, can I use these three terms? So meaning reproductive rights, reproductive health, and reproductive justice interchangeably?
So this is why I wanted to show that slide, because they are often used interchangeably, but they're very different frameworks. And so it's really, I think most of the time when people are using the term reproductive justice, they're probably thinking about reproductive rights. And oftentimes, the service delivery piece of this is not necessarily something that's being centered in these conversations in general. Most of the time when we're talking about access we're often concerned about the targeted restrictions against abortion providers more specifically, but not necessarily the fact that independent abortion clinics that provide the majority of second trimester abortion care are closing across the country. And so that impacts the ability for people to receive those healthcare services.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I wanted to make sure that people left with that important takeaway. We have questions about WHPA. I'm going to lump them all together. So one is, for DC folks that do not have a senator, what do we do? And then the second that is WHPA specific is, what is our strategy for getting it through the Senate? A very popular voting bill was filibustered today. How can we get WHPA to succeed in today's Senate?
Sure. So thank you for those questions. So in terms of if you are a resident of DC, we still strongly urge members to call Congresswoman Eleanor Holmes Norton, because she has excellent relationships with Democratic senators on the Senate side, and is actually an incredible advocate for making sure the voices of folks in DC are heard despite not having the representation they should have. And additionally, there's absolutely no harm in calling senators from Virginia and Maryland. That's what I would say. Why not? And in terms of the Senate, so great question. So to level set a little bit briefly, in the Senate, any bill that we would like to see a vote on to pass it, first faces a vote called a cloture vote. And the term filibuster, which most people are familiar with, probably from the West Wing, is essentially now just you have to get 60 votes to end debate to hold a regular, majority of 51 vote on any bill. So 60 votes, it means it's an old Senate relic that frankly is a relic of the Jim Crow era and has been used primarily to block access to all sorts of civil rights and racial justice bills, anti-lynching bills, Civil Rights Act. It has a generally speaking, pretty bad history. It is also something that the progressive community writ large, Nero included, is really opposed to. Nero's taken a position against the filibuster because we can't, because of voting rights and the fact that many districts are in fact gerrymandered. We're in a situation where we're doing everything we can to get a Senate vote on WHPA, knowing it will fail. Because we're not going to get 60 votes. We're not going to get 10 Republicans. However, it is our hope that we will get 50 votes, and along with many other important issues, including voting rights, convince the Senate to end the filibuster. We have to end the filibuster to enact WHPA. That's the bottom line. Like many, frankly, that's true of, for example, the Equality Act, a landmark LGBTQ bill that is being held up by the filibuster. I could go on and on in terms of other issues, paycheck fairness, Pregnant Workers Discrimination Act. There are lots of things that could get 50 but not 60 votes. And so that's the bottom line. And so it is, essentially we need to vote on the Women's Health Protection Act and have that vote by any means necessary, end the filibuster to do it, to have a real vote. We can't allow Mitch McConnell to hijack what needs to get done.
Thank you, Kate. The next question is, how do we get more clinics to open in safe states to deal with the influx of patients in states with strict abortion bans?
Doctor, I'm happy to take a pass, but Dr. Taylor, if you want to start, feel free.
No, you can take a pass. I'm collecting my thoughts.
I think part of it is that we need more clinics writ large, right? It's not just, I want to frame the approach as needing more clinics everywhere. We don't want to cede that we will be in a situation that abortion will only be legal in some states. We're going to keep fighting. And the other piece of that is that's a broader healthcare access issue in this country. We don't make it easy to access healthcare, period. And that's also about funding, and to Dr. Taylor's point about how we can be and aren't within the healthcare system supporting independent clinics as well.
Thank you. I think that was an important way to start to answer that. From a provider standpoint, in general in healthcare, we have this phenomenon called the graying of providers. And so, we still have abortion providers who, if they were not providing abortion, would be retired because of the concern of not having the necessary pipeline of physicians coming up in the ranks who want to provide abortion care. And part of that issue is, I would say, just as the same as with public opinion, the majority of physicians are pro-choice, but because it's such a political issue, people get the choice to just kind of be like, I don't want to deal with that. I'll let somebody else deal with that. And so we have that phenomenon happening. And so I don't know that necessarily opening more clinics is going to, be the answer, because we have, a social construct right now that makes it undesirable for the average physician to provide abortion care to their patients. A first trimester abortion, medical abortion, should be available in anyone's primary care doctor's office. And a lot of patients think that's the case. I remember having an argument on my Instagram with someone who was like, I could just go to my doctor and get an abortion. I was like, okay, go try. Because it's not as easy as you would think, but it should be, right? And then also just the way that healthcare has changed over time as well, in terms of, where people access care, insurance coverage, and all those things that Kate mentioned earlier in the introduction. So the idea of just opening more clinics as an answer is not really addressing some of the underlying reasons that people don't have access to care.
Can I just add really, really briefly?
Yes.
One of the contributing reasons why, like Dr. Taylor said, people don't want to learn how to provide abortion care or just decide not to, is because of the vitriol and the violence and the extreme rhetoric that is promoted by the anti-choice movement, and this constant bombardment of attacks, this surveillance of abortion providers. So I think part of this problem is also helping people understand, like, that is what the anti-choice movement does. It is not a well-intentioned, benevolent movement. It is encouraging harassment of doctors. It is encouraging surveillance of doctors. And they're really working to put up as many barriers and restrictions to make people not want to provide that care, because they just know that they are going to be flooded with so much hatred and vitriol. And so that's also why, again, I just want to thank Dr. Taylor and so many abortion providers for putting up with that. And it's honestly heinous. And I think that that's part of the reason why we really need to be better about calling out the anti-choice movement for what it is, talking about the motivations of these people and the world that they're trying to create and like what they are working towards.
Thanks to all three of you. We have many more questions to get through, but we've run out of time. So it's been really wonderful to see how engaged our audience has been so far. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of the questions, but please continue joining NARAL events and we will get to them. So I'm going to kick it over. I want to thank our panelists once again. Kate, Gabby, Dr. Taylor, thank you. Kate and Gabby both mentioned this, but we're grateful for not just the care you provide, but the advocacy that you do in your time outside of your practice. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to kick it over to Lucia, who will move us into the next portion of our event.
Thanks, Amy, and welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of our members in the chat. My name is Lucia Diaz-French. I use she, her pronouns, and I am one of our national distributed organizers here at NARAL. As we've heard, there's a lot of urgency with WHPA. We have to make phone calls and get our senators to vote on this bill. And so we are going to be doing a phone bank tonight. I hope that you all stay and join us. We need all of your help in making these phone calls tonight. So we are going to run through a training on the phone bank system we will be using tonight. And then myself and another organizer from Nero will be here hanging out in the Zoom to answer any questions. So don't worry, we won't leave you hanging. But we are going to start out with a brief training video, and then we'll move into questions, and then we'll start making calls. So Kate, if you want to jump into that video, we can get folks going here.
Hold on one second.
Sign in as a volunteer. On the agent login screen, enter your email address, the campaign ID, and the passcode provided by the campaign. If it's your first time logging into HubDialer, check this box. If not, just click Log In. You can read in detail how the calling process works. You'll also see a preview of the script you'll be using during your calls. After reviewing all this info, click Let's Get Started. You'll now call into HubDialer. Use your phone to dial the number on the screen. HubDialer will say,
"Welcome to the HubDialer. Enter your dialing code followed by the pound sign. Calls may be monitored for quality control. Your confirmation code is
970.
Go ahead. Enter your confirmation code into your web browser.
Enter your code and then click Start Calls. HubDialer will say,
Please wait to be connected.
Then HubDialer will immediately work to get you connected with a targeted call recipient. You'll hear a tone. That means someone is on the line and it's time to start talking right away. Hi, this is Jennifer. I'm calling from the Blue for President campaign. May I please speak to Rose Hartman? Your call recipient says, This is Rose. Hi, if the election for president were held today, for whom would you vote? Candidate blue, candidate red, candidate green, or are you not sure? I like candidate blue. Great. Please remember to vote on Tuesday. Your polling location is 1003 G Street. Thank you. You're welcome. Goodbye. Now that you've completed the call, you can click Next Call to get connected with another call recipient. Or if you're all done, you can click This is my last call. Next, you'll see how an agent makes calls if they're using a telephone, but no computer. These agents will use a printed HubDialer script that has specific instructions for phone-only agents, enabling them to log call results using the touch-tone keypad. As a phone-only agent, you'll dial into the phone number at the top of your script, and then follow HubDialer's instructions. HubDialer will say,
Welcome to the HubDialer. Enter your campaign ID, followed by the pound sign. Enter your passcode, followed by the pound sign. Calls may be monitored for quality control. Your agent ID is
562970.
You are now being moved to the agent queue. Please wait to be connected.
Soon you'll hear a tone. That means someone is on the line and it's time to start talking. Hi, this is Jennifer. I'm calling from the Blue for President campaign. If the election for president were held today, for whom would you vote? Candidate blue, candidate red, candidate green, or are you not sure? The call recipient says, I like candidate blue. Great. Please remember to vote on Tuesday. If you need your polling location, please call 1-888-555-1212. Have a great day. Goodbye. Then HubDialer will say,
Enter the call results now. Please enter the response to each question in order using 0 for any unanswered questions. If you did not reach the expected person, dial star and the 2-digit disposition code.
Once you've used your touch-tone keypad to enter call results, you're immediately put back in the queue for another HubDialer call.
Please wait to be connected.
When you're done making calls, wait until HubDialer prompts you for the call results. and then enter *00. You'll enter the results of your final call, and then Hub Dialer will end the calling session. Now that your agents have begun making calls, you're ready to learn how to manage, monitor, and report on your Hub Dialer campaign.
Okay, so those are the basics of using Hub Dialer. Before we get into phone calls, we want to thank all of our members joining us on social media, Facebook, YouTube. We are going to stick to Zoom now and make some calls. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Hopefully we'll connect with you again very soon.